Humans have been making transactions for thousands of years, and they've long become a fundamental part of our lives. Most purchases are relatively straightforward. We'll give you $12 for this piece of dough with tomato, mozzarella, and pepperoni on it. Or this charming 4-bedroom house is yours if you can deposit $450,000 into our accounts. Transactions, usually fairly mundane, but not all of them. Now and again, something truly bizarre pops up. So here's our pick of the 5 most outrageous transactions in history. Over the last few years, a story has repeatedly emerged set in the dying embers of the Soviet Union that sounds so outrageous it has left many scratching their heads, wondering whether it's actually true. The story often includes the eye-catching line, "Pepsi once had the 7th largest navy in the world thanks to a bizarre deal struck with the Soviet Union in 1989. Now, while this isn't entirely accurate on many levels, the story of how PepsiCo Inc. purchased 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer from the Soviet Union is absolutely true. As the Cold War began heating up, the United States publicly did its best to isolate the Soviet Union economically. The two countries never traded directly, and the Soviet ruble wasn't traded in the global market like the dollar was. However, during the American National Exhibition in Moscow in 1959, the US government decided that one of the best ways to gain the ideological upper hand was to demonstrate the glories of American capitalism lavishly. Kodak, General Electric, and Pepsi-Cola were among the invited companies to present goods at the exhibition, which President Eisenhower hoped would leave the Soviet public drooling over American goods. One remarkable picture taken at the event showed Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev drinking from a Pepsi cup, and it was this photo that set the ball rolling for what would happen decades in the future. While purchasing American goods was out of the question in the early 1970s, bartering was seen as a smart way around the official guidelines. In 1972, Pepsi began swapping syrup that could be mixed with carbonated water to create a Soviet version of Pepsi. It was a sneaky move that locked Coca-Cola out of the Soviet market entirely and positioned Pepsi in pole position to take advantage if and when official sales and trading began between the two countries. In 1985, there were 16 bottling factories in the Soviet Union packaging Pepsi, and there seemed genuine hope that a calming peace between East and West would flourish even further. American businesses began cautiously dipping their toes into the slowly liberalizing Soviet Union, with McDonald's, Baskin-Robbins, and Pizza Hut among the first. They thought that when the shackles were thrown off and the Soviet Union joined the capitalist world, it would be a cash cow of extraordinary proportions. In 1989, it seemed as if the Soviets were on the cusp of dramatic change. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and the nation held elections for its new legislative body, but limitations for Pepsi remained. The vodka market, which they previously swapped their Pepsi for, had lost its profitability, so a new barter product was needed. By this point, Pepsi was run by a man named Donald M. Kendall, who just so happened to have a friend who ran a Norwegian shipping company interested in purchasing old Soviet ships to be used as scrap. At the time, they still couldn't buy them directly, so a joint venture between Pepsi, the Norwegians, and the Soviet government was established. The first order included 2 oil tankers, but was eventually expanded to include 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. In essence, Pepsi was only ever the middleman in the transaction, with the ships going straight to the Norwegians, who paid Pepsi for them. A further 85 vessels were scheduled to be included in a deal over the next decade, but when the Soviet Union came crashing down, so did the Pepsi Navy deal. Some people are just born with the kind of charisma that allows them to get away with things that seem barely believable, and Victor Lustig was one such person. Born on the 4th of January 1890 in Hostin in Austria-Hungary, Lustig was an intelligent child from an early age. However, rather than using his impressive intellect for good, he fell into a life of crime by his late teens. One of his earliest scams involved traveling aboard ocean liners between Britain and America. Lustig would pose as a successful businessman in the final stages of putting together a brand new Broadway show, and would target the rich and, should we say, rather gullible travelers into contributing to the project. When World War I erupted and all passenger shipping effectively ceased, Lustig turned his attention to banks in the United States and pushed his luck about as far as it could possibly go before hightailing it back to Europe just a few steps ahead of the FBI. Lustig settled in Paris and initially set about running the same kind of scams, but an extraordinary possibility soon captured his attention. By the mid-1920s, the Eiffel Tower was nearly 35 years old, and a lot of the shine that had initially accompanied it had worn off. itself. Many Parisians felt indifferent about their iconic landmark, and with the local government struggling to meet its high maintenance costs, solemn whispers began circling that the tower might be pulled down and sold for scrap. Lustig jumped at the opportunity, and after employing a friend to make him some government stationery, he invited some of the leading figures in the scrap metal industry to a meeting where he told them that he was the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs, and said that yes, the Eiffel Tower was going to be scrapped, and whoever came back with the highest offer would profit from it. This is where Lustig really set himself apart, though. Not content with merely faking the sale of the Eiffel Tower, Lustig instigated the second part of his audacious plan. He singled a particular person out at the meeting, André Poisson, an insecure man who was hell-bent on making a name for himself in the industry, and arranged a private meeting with him, where he insinuated that he might be open to a bribe in order to guarantee Poisson the contract. It worked perfectly. Not only did Poisson pay the 70,000 francs to purchase the Eiffel Tower, a bargain at around $2,500 in today's money, but it was also a sizable bribe thought to be at about the same amount. Lustig fled to Austria to lay low, but returned to Paris later that year and set about running the same scam. He came pretty close to doing it all again, but a tip-off to the police saw him flee back to the United States, again, one step ahead of the authorities. Lustig continued his devious ways across America, but was finally caught in 1935 after his mistress took revenge and informed the police of his whereabouts upon discovering that he was involved with the younger women. Lustig was sentenced to 20 years in prison on charges of counterfeiting and died in Alcatraz in 1947 after suffering pneumonia. On his death certificate, his occupation was listed as apprentice salesman. In 193 AD, the Roman Empire was entering a period of turmoil. The year prior, Emperor Commodus, portrayed in the film Gladiator, had been assassinated, and there weren't too many throughout the empire who shed a tear for the megalomaniacal, narcissistic thug. Rome was ready for a new emperor. But who? The first man saddled with what would quickly become a poisoned chalice was Publius Helvius Pertinax, a Roman senator and former army officer. Pertinax remained at the pinnacle of the empire for just 3 months, during which he attempted to instigate various reforms, including the restoration of discipline among the Praetorian Guard, the personal bodyguards and intelligence agents for the Roman emperors. These actions proved deeply unpopular, and on the 28th of March, 193 AD, a group of 300 Praetorian soldiers stormed the palace and killed the emperor. So much for bodyguards. And here's where things got downright dirty. Shortly after the emperor's assassination, the Praetorian Guard made the quite astonishing announcement that the position of emperor, and in effect the entire empire, would be sold to the highest bidder. This money would not make its way into Rome's treasury, as one might assume, but rather into the hands of each Praetorian member. 2 men immediately made their way to the Praetorian camp. The first was Titus Flavius Claudius Sulpicianus, a prefect of Rome and Pertinax's father-in-law. The second arriving shortly after was Marcus Didius Julianus, a former consul of Rome whom Commodus had demoted. Reports from the time talk about back and forths between the 2 men. Sulpicianus finally offered 20,000 sesterces to every soldier. However, wealthy Didius bested him with a final offer of 25,000 per man, a figure worth around 10 horses. Glorious Rome had apparently descended to the filth situated somewhere below rock bottom. Didius was proclaimed emperor, and he lived happily ever after. No, just joking. Within days, Didius had devalued the Roman currency to attempt to squeeze out of his purchase and quickly became deeply unpopular in Rome and across the empire. 3 separate rebellions broke out, and while 2 were eventually put down, one led by Septimius Severus in Pannonia, now part of the Balkans, pushed forward and gained momentum and support. By late May 193 AD, all support for Didius had collapsed, and on the 2nd of June he was murdered in his palace by a Praetorian soldier, and Severus assumed the role of emperor. Yes, this entry is really about Napoleon's penis. When the once great emperor died in exile on St. Helena in 1821, the story goes that his penis was amputated during the autopsy carried out by Francesco Antomarchi, Napoleon's longtime physician. Why this happens, we're not quite sure. Some say it was accidental. Some say Antomarchi took revenge on Bonaparte for once calling him impotent. Who really knows? And so begins the tale and global travels of Napoleon's cock. Apparently, the dismembered phallus was smuggled off St. Helena by a chaplain returning to Corsica, Napoleon's birthplace, where it remained in the priest's family until 1916. It's not exactly clear how the shriveled up penis was later put up for sale, but the story goes that it was first purchased by Maggs Brothers Ltd, a book-selling company based in London, before being sold on to ASW Rosenbach, a Philadelphia-based bookseller, in 1924. The penis hit the big time in 1927 when it went went on display at the New York City's Museum of French Art. Viewers at the time described it as similar to a maltreated strip of buckskin shoelace or a shriveled eel. Rosenberg later sold it to a collector named Donald Hyde, whose wife eventually sold it to John K. Latimer in 1977 for $3,000, equivalent to $14,488 today. Interestingly, this was the same position that the Kennedy family chose in 1972 as the first non-governmental expert to examine evidence taken at JFK's autopsy. The penis remains with the Latimer family to this day, but they kindly refer to the shriveled piece of skin, reportedly just 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters in length, poor guy, as Napoleon's item, proof that people will buy absolutely anything. From the start of the Cold War until the mid-1980s, the United States threw financial aid around like there was no tomorrow, often to appalling dictators, rebel factions, or really anybody willing to put their hands up and call out communism, whether they believed it or not. The problem was, this often didn't go very well. In 1984, the Democratic-led Congress passed legislation that banned both direct and indirect US military aid to rebel fighters worldwide, but in particular to a group known as the Contras in Nicaragua. Nicaragua had recently toppled its long-term right-wing dictator, Tabale, who had long siphoned money out of the country while crushing any discord with terrifying force, and with a left-leaning firebrand now in place, the United States was getting nervy that Nicaragua might become the perfect launchpad to see communism spread throughout the continent. However, there was hope for them in the form of a right-wing rebel group known as the Contras, who were fighting the new government, mostly from Honduras. Across the world, in Iran, the US had a similar problem. Their long-term friend and ally, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had been toppled in a popular revolution that had seen Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and his Islamic fundamentalists rise to power. Needless to say, after the storming of the US Embassy in 1979 and the holding of hostages for 444 days, the new regime was not a fan of the United States, and the feeling was perfectly mutual. So at this point, the United States wanted to fund the Contras to fight their proxy wars in Central America. However, thanks to that pesky idea drummed up by the founding fathers regarding separation of power, Congress blocked it entirely. What happened next was outrageous in the extreme. In 1982, 7 US hostages were being held by Hezbollah, a group closely tied to Iran, in Lebanon, and the American government had somehow concluded that by selling arms to Iran, they might be able to persuade the Iranian government to put pressure on Hezbollah to release the hostages. Of course, the government was not allowed to sell arms to Iran directly because of an arms embargo, but they managed to find a way around it by using non-appropriated funds instead. Now, this was not just about the hostages. The US had long funneled weapons into Iran before the revolution, and now those same weapons were in desperate need of spare parts. So while in public the United States denounced the Iranian government, behind closed doors they were actively looking for ways of getting weapons into the country, especially as a way of keeping the Soviet Union out of the picture. And that's precisely what happened. By using non-appropriated funds that couldn't be tracked, the US began sending weapons to Iran in 1985 to help the country fight its ongoing war with Iraq. Shortly after this began, some of the proceeds of these sales were quietly diverted to a private company known as The Enterprise, which then used the money to purchase weaponry for the Contras. The fiasco came crashing down just a year later when a plane carrying weapons to the Contras was shot down over Nicaragua with its pilot taken prisoner by the Sandinistas. Ronald Reagan was forced to confirm the Iran-Contra affair live on television, a hugely embarrassing moment for the United States, who had long championed tough action regarding Iran. A full investigation was launched, but because the two senators charged with investigating were never given subpoena powers, the whole thing never really got very far. And things were hampered even further when a treasure trove of documents were accidentally destroyed. And yes, accidentally destroyed like this, because who smells a cover-up?